Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the world has been flooded with shocking images, emotional narratives, and sensational headlines. But what really happened behind the cameras? Did the Western press show us the truth, or were we manipulated by an information war as complex as the conflict itself? In this video, we will uncover how the Western media shaped public perception, omitted crucial facts, and created a narrative that may have distorted the reality of the war. Get ready for an in-depth analysis of geopolitical strategy and the power of information. Hello, warriors of the Arte de Guerra channel. In today's video, we will understand how the press influenced the narrative from both the left and the right regarding the war in Ukraine. We see both the right and the left demonizing Russia and praising the imperialism that supported, through NATO and the European Union, the Ukrainians. They made a Russian-Ukrainian salad with the facts, but one thing that can't be denied is that both the left and the right in Brazil see the war in the same way. They converged on this, which is very complicated indeed. But let's take a look at the facts, and then I'll make some quite interesting comments for you. Follow along with us. Well, this article, as you remember, is from February 26, 2022, 2 days after the war started. So, they claim that the Russian army was using a mobile crematorium, that there were many casualties. This was never proven, which is worse. Some media here in Brazil, many of them with great reach, shared this false news. I think this is one of the most absurd ones, right? Along the lines of the Russians running out of fuel. We need to remember that Russia has one of the largest oil and gas reserves on the planet. It's very hard to believe such news. Then this, just over 3 weeks into the war, how did the Ukrainian army manage to halt the advance of Russian troops? They didn't manage to halt it. That's the truth. Russia continued making its advances. At some points in this war, it managed to control 30% of Ukraine's territory, and today controls about 20% to 25%. Well, this one will complete 3 years in 12 days. Russia has ammunition and food for no more than 3 days, says Ukraine. And yet the war has dragged on for 3 years. This one came with the month of war. They state that the Russian army was unable to replenish its troops, so they were forgiving soldiers' debts to enlist. And there's also this from April 2022, that troop morale is weakened. Russia will soon be exhausted due to the weakening of its military capabilities, etc. This is from April 2022. It's going to be 3 years. This must have been an April Fool's joke. It can only be, right? B attack kills 3 Russian soldiers and injures another 25. As if the B were a patriot. As if the B had enlisted in the army. Anyway, it was one of the most ridiculous among all the nonsense the press put out. But there's more. Look here. Putin's army is running out of ammunition because the parts are manufactured in Ukraine. April 3, 2022, I say again, running out of ammunition. And this war dragged on for 3 years. So only if the parts manufactured in Ukraine continue to be sold to Russia. That must be it, for those who believe. They came back here with the story of the crematoriums, which were never seen or heard of. Well, this is from May 10, 2022. Russia needs to sell oil and is running out of options. Over time, it has actually been proven that Europe never stopped buying oil from Russia, and the Russians never stopped making an absurd profit from selling their oil and gas. This is also from May 2022, the so-called Ghost of Kiev, which never appeared. What was seen in the end is that Ukraine's air force was decimated, and they needed emergency supplies of F-16 and Mirage 2000 jets. And here's another one. Russia uses refrigerator chips in military equipment, say the United States. We have to remember that this refrigerator chip is causing enormous damage, leaving Ukraine almost without electricity. And this one is from May 29, 2022. Putin has cancer and has 3 months to live. So, in about 2 months and 10 days, you can check that. I'm not sure if this prediction will come true.
Se essa previsão vai se concretizar. A gente tem mais essa. Adolescente vira herói de guerra.
We have another one. Teenager becomes a war hero, pilots a drone in Ukraine, attacks and destroys the Russian convoy. These are always fanciful stories of heroism, or stories that play with people's imagination. Bees, ghosts, a miraculous teenager, some rather complicated things. It's hard to believe all of this. Then, finally, on June 10, 2022, the truth starts to emerge. Ukraine admits it was running out of ammunition. If it weren't for NATO's help, especially from the United States, Ukraine would have already lost this war. But despite the debacle, they continue with the lies. Look at this one. Ukrainian goat explodes grenade and injures 40 Russian soldiers. I mean, a patriotic goat, like the bees, must be from the same regiment as the killer bees. And then we start to see the result of this. Brazilians dying who believed in this story. When this article was published, it was the third Brazilian. Now I believe that number has already exceeded 24. People who were misled in this whole story believed it would be an easy thing. You would return from there as a hero and end up buried. Well, folks, we need to understand why this approach by the press caused so much commotion on the left and the right, and both sides were left without understanding what was happening in the war in Ukraine. So we prepared a report here saying the following. First of all, that the narratives were unilateral. So what happens? Most Western media outlets had a predominantly pro-Ukraine narrative. They did not delve into it, did not enter the historical context, the Russian motivations, the common history that the two countries have. So the public only saw one side. It's natural that they would have taken a stance based on what they effectively knew. This is perfectly understandable. Well, as I also showed, many unverified and exaggerated pieces of information were spread as if they were facts. There was no filter for this. In fact, what was set aside right at the beginning of the war was any filter that wasn't pro-Ukraine. So they inflated Ukraine's victories and magnified Russia's defeats, when things weren't exactly like that. Another thing is that the press highlighted the evidence. For example, that case with Bush. Oh, because Russia is this, Russia is that, etc. Later, it was proven that none of that was true. And they forget that Ukraine used human shields, forget that there were ultranationalists in the Ukrainian armed forces who formed independent units, even very well armed and prepared. And these ultranationalist units, Red, Nazis, are responsible for some atrocities during this war. There was also a great polarization, a sensationalism. So it is portrayed as if Russia were the absolute villain and Ukraine innocent. We need to remember that Ukrainians committed massacres against the Poles in World War II, and many Ukrainians openly collaborated with the Nazi occupation forces in the Soviet Union during the years of World War II. Another thing is that they always used biased sources. So the biased sources received support, received subsidies, and were given a platform to speak. Thus, this whole narrative, this whole story was created, and it's very difficult to undo this in people's minds. Another thing is that the press never touched on the negative side effects, especially concerning their own bosses. For example, they don't address the energy crisis in Europe, the rise in food prices in various countries. They overlook these issues, and these issues stem from the way sanctions against Russia were mainly implemented. Another important fact, of course, is censorship. I talk to many Europeans, and they are amazed to see the freedom we have in Brazil. We have access to media from both sides, whereas in Europe, for example, Russian media is censored. Well, we will continue to follow this and take a look at some more absurdities that have been published by the press during these years of war. Here we have some clippings from English media from Dr. Rodolfo Latter's archive, all saying the same thing, that Russia was failing. that the troops were in a very complicated situation, that the Russian army was falling apart, and that Ukraine's incursions could change the war. They always exaggerate the achievements of the Ukrainian armed forces. I put all this here for you to see that it's not just in the Brazilian media. You see that, in general, Brazilian media only translates.
As mídias brasileiras só fazem tradução, uma parte, né, dos
Some Brazilian columnists translate what is in the foreign media or base their opinions on what they read in foreign media. There is no filter, no critical sense regarding what they are reading. I draw attention to the exaggerated casualties. It is claimed that Russia lost half of its tanks, 900 soldiers per day. In 1,000 days, Russia would have already lost 900,000 soldiers, which is totally impractical, if we look at it. And these waves of soldiers too, zombie strategy, one nonsense after another, loss of 20% of supersonic fighters, 120,000 soldiers killed against 50,000 more from Ukraine. And we see Ukraine in that difficult situation of calling up troops. Now they have stated that Russia lost 90% of its soldiers. It's something like, it's a complete absurdity. But you see that this coverage is uniform throughout the West. It wasn't just in Brazil. I remember, Brazil effectively copies a part there. The columnists do a copy-paste from English, put it in the translator, and only at the end does the true face of the war start to appear. So, for example, Ukraine effectively ran out of ammunition. Europe was suffering a lot because of the energy cost problem. Then we saw the near bankruptcy of Volkswagen, the situation with BASF, etc. In short, the lies were falling one by one. But it's impressive how many people still believe that Ukraine is winning this war, believe in all this array of lies from Ukraine.
Esse cabedal de mentiras aí da Ucrânia. Uma outra coisa também é que se exagerou.
Another thing is that the role of General Zaluzhny was exaggerated. He is not a military genius, as is being proven day by day for those who assess the operations while he was the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces. Well, folks, I think those who watched the video up to now understood what happened. The amount of lies that were told and that everyone believed. Many people who believed in this ended up paying with their lives, like some Brazilians who, seduced by these narratives, went to Ukraine and ended up falling in that overwhelming war. Now it's interesting, it's very curious to see how the narrative, the understanding of the war in Brazil, both from the left and the liberal left, not the historical left, but the liberal left and the right, became the same thing. Which is strange, because normally the left has always delved more into geopolitical issues. It has always had a more in-depth view of geopolitical issues. But that wasn't the case. People went with the narrative that it was a fight between good and evil, without analyzing historical aspects, without having a critical filter regarding these major events. So, when someone comes to you and says, look, Putin is a communist, or someone would say Putin is a communist and says, the people on the left think he's a fascist, you are agreeing with the people on the left. Both of you demonize Putin. That's what effectively happened. They made lemonade with these people's brains. So tell us what you thought of this video, if you think the press was telling the truth, or if you agree with what we presented. Share your impressions about the media coverage of the Ukraine war in your comment. I'll leave you with the intro of a course we have at the War Command School. The link for those interested in purchasing it is here in the description about Russia's wars. Russia has fought more than 200 wars to date. The course instructor is Colonel Coutinho. If you want to support our channel, subscribe and share. You can contribute via Super Chat or Pix, which is in the video description. We'll be back shortly, always with responsibility and commitment. Faith in Brazil, folks. See you later.
Fé no Brasil, pessoal. Até mais. pessoal, eu vou deixar aqui no link na
Well,
descrição
folks,
deste
I will
vídeo
leave in the link in the description of this video our entire line of books about Ukraine, available on Amazon. There's a lot in various languages and formats as well. You'll find things on Kindle in print format, right? What happens is that Amazon delivers very quickly, especially for those who live here in the capital, São Paulo. It also accepts payment by boleto, credit card, installment plans, etc. And I remind you, every time you buy books and other items on Amazon, you are supporting the Arte da Guerra channel.
Itens na Amazon, vocês estão ajudando o canal Arte da Guerra.
Captioned by Sonia Roberti.